You don't expect to come home to betrayal in broad daylight, not with sunlight pouring through the windows like everything's still normal, not with the scent of lemon cleaner lingering like the house is ready to welcome you home. But betrayal has no courtesy, no warning, no need for shadows. It waits in your living room, smirking. And when I opened that door on a perfectly ordinary Thursday afternoon, what greeted me wasn't my husband's familiar voice asking how my day was. No. What greeted me was the unmistakable sound of a woman laughing, a high, syrupy kind of laugh I'd never heard echo through my home before. I froze on the threshold, the door half open in my hand, as if somehow my senses had failed me, as if maybe I'd walked into the wrong house. But there was my coat rack, there was the small scuff in the floorboard Jonathan had promised to fix 3 years ago, and there was the framed photo of our wedding on the console table, staring at me like a joke I didn't understand yet. And there he was, my husband of 15 years, Jonathan Evans, standing in the middle of our living room like a smug little emperor, watching two moving men carry in a plush velvet settee that definitely didn't belong to either of us. And next to him, wearing leggings so tight I could see the tag through the fabric and an off-the-shoulder sweater that screamed, "I'm not here to be subtle," was the woman. I didn't recognize her, not in a familiar sense, but I knew who she was the moment I saw the way she stood, possessive and giddy, next to my husband. Her manicured hand grazed the small of his back as if she'd already taken ownership of everything in this house, including the man standing in it. "Claire," Jonathan called out, entirely unbothered, as if I was the one who needed to explain myself. "You're home early." I didn't answer him right away. I just stepped inside, let the door shut behind me, and took in the absurdity of it all. There were boxes, hers, clearly, stacked by the staircase. There was a duffel bag on the armchair I'd bought on our anniversary trip to Charleston. There were suitcases with neon tags lined up like travelers awaiting their next journey, except this journey had already started without me. "I thought you'd be at your mother's until the weekend," he added, his tone so casual it bordered on insulting. He smiled, then turned to the girl. "Babe, this is Claire." "Claire, this is, well, you'll figure it out." I remember my heels clicking slowly across the hardwood, the sound oddly grounding, as if the rhythm of my steps could keep me from coming undone. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the framed photo at his head, though the weight of it in my hand was suddenly very tempting. I just looked at him, and then at her, and then back again. "You're moving her in?" My voice came out quieter than I expected, but sharper too, like a scalpel slicing through the theater of this little charade. Jonathan chuckled, a low laugh that told me he'd rehearsed this moment, maybe in front of a mirror. "Claire, don't be dramatic. We've been over for a long time. This is just formalizing it." "Formalizing it?" I echoed, still somehow stunned. "Without the courtesy of divorce papers?" "There's no need for all that," he said, waving his hand like divorce was just an inconvenient bit of paperwork. "We can skip the legal drama. You're independent. You've got your business, your little boutique. You'll land on your feet." The girl, half a smile on her gloss lips, sat on the arm of the couch, swinging her foot like she was waiting for us to finish arguing so she could get back to setting up her new nest. I stood very still. Not because I was frozen, but because every part of me was trying not to ignite. It wasn't just the betrayal, or the gall, or the fact that he'd tried to shrink 15 years of partnership into a careless wave and a smug speech. It was the disrespect. The assumption that I would crumple quietly, step aside gracefully, and let him replace me like I was a subscription he'd canceled. "You don't have to make this ugly," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "We're adults." I let my eyes wander across the room, at the mismatched chaos of her things invading my space, at the way she was already flipping through the channels on my remote like she was testing the fit of her new life, and something inside me clicked. I didn't yell. I didn't fall apart. I walked upstairs slowly, with the kind of calm that made him uneasy. In our bedroom, I opened the closet and pulled out the suitcase I'd once used for our anniversary trip, the same one he refused to help me carry through the cobblestone streets of Prague because his back was acting up. I packed. Methodically. Efficiently. Just a few clothes. Just the essentials. Everything else could wait. I didn't hear him follow me, which meant he probably didn't care. That stung a little more than I was ready to admit. When I came back down, he was in the kitchen, opening a bottle of wine that I had ordered for our anniversary, but he never got around to opening. She was still curled on the couch, scrolling her phone now, barely looking up. I picked up my purse, my keys, and paused. Then I turned to him, quiet and clear. "You have no idea who you just betrayed," I said. His brows lifted, amused. "Oh, come on, Claire. Don't start playing the martyr." But I wasn't playing anything. I was done playing. I stepped outside into the sunlight, the warmth of it a sharp contrast to the coldness I was leaving behind. I didn't slam the door. I didn't need to. A storm doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives. And Jonathan Evans was about to learn what devastation looks like when it walks out the door with grace. I imagine Jonathan felt victorious that morning. He probably poured himself a smug cup of coffee in the kitchen I remodeled, brushed steel appliances, matte black tile, quartz countertops he once called too feminine. I imagine he stretched in his robe, the same one he used to wear while pretending to help me on lazy Sunday mornings, except this time it wasn't me pouring the orange juice. No, this time it was Melissa, the girl in eyeliner and crop tops, still playing dress-up in the life I handed over without a fight. Let him have his moment, I thought, as I watched the time tick toward 9 a.m. on the burner phone in my hand. It had been years since I used that number. Years since I checked in with the name they still had me filed under. Claire Evans may have married Jonathan, but the woman behind her was someone entirely different, someone he never saw because he never bothered to look. The call would come precisely at 9:07 a.m. I knew because I arranged it. The Bureau always loved punctuality. I didn't ask them to go easy on him. I didn't ask them to explain gently. He made his bed of arrogance and carelessness. Now he could lie awake in it, wondering how long I had been 2 steps ahead. I wasn't in the house anymore, but I could imagine every detail of his reaction. His face twisting first with confusion, then disbelief, then fear when he heard the words, "This is Special Agent Dana Caldwell with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to speak with you about Claire Evans." I knew exactly what would follow, his nervous laughter, that bark of disbelief that always made me cringe in meetings when he didn't know he was wrong yet. And then that moment, the sweet, seismic pause, when the world would tilt on its axis and Jonathan Evans would realize he never knew the woman sleeping beside him for the last 15 years. Because I wasn't just Claire. I was the agent assigned to investigate his company's offshore transfers, his backdoor dealings with shell firms in the Cayman Islands, his quiet little laundering deals disguised as bonuses and consulting fees. I was placed in his life to track the very financial rot he tried so hard to keep buried beneath layers of suburban normalcy and casual misogyny. The marriage? That was part of the cover. The boutique? My own idea, actually. They wanted me in his shadow. I insisted on standing in my own light. The shop gave me legitimacy, stability, and, more importantly, financial independence. Jonathan thought it was cute. He called it my little project. I let him think a lot of things. I let him believe he was smarter. Let him believe I was harmless. Let him believe his lies passed unnoticed while I quietly built a file the size of a phone book documenting every discrepancy, every business trip, every late-night wire transfer. He kept thinking he was the hunter, when really, he'd been the mark from the beginning. There were moments, quiet, human moments, when I let myself wonder what it might have been like to love him for real. There were nights when he held my hand in the dark, thinking he was protecting me from something, not knowing I was the one watching over both of us. But those moments were always fleeting. Because every time I saw his emails to colleagues mocking me, every time he belittled my intelligence in front of clients, every time he referred to me as just his wife, with that smug half-smile, I remembered who I was. And who I wasn't. At 9:08 a.m., the text started rolling in. First from my lawyer, freeze order confirmed. Joint accounts suspended. Property rights are uncontested. Then one from a friend still embedded at his firm, there at the office. 3 agents, badges visible. Panic level, DEFCON 1. I stood by the window of my new apartment, rented under a different name, of course, watching the city wake up around me. Melissa, I imagined, was standing in the doorway with her phone halfway to her ear, asking Jonathan what was going on while he paced the floor, trying to spin a narrative that made him look like the victim. That was his greatest weakness, really, his refusal to believe he could ever be powerless. He didn't know how to see women like me as anything more than supporting roles in the grand theater of his life. But this wasn't a play. It was a takedown. He'd call, I was sure of it. He'd call and demand answers. Maybe he already had. I kept my phone off, not because I was afraid, but because I had no interest in listening to a man beg for answers he wouldn't understand. Jonathan would never grasp the depth of what he'd lost. Not just a wife, not just a house, not even his freedom. He lost the illusion of control. He lost the right to say he knew me. And the cruelest irony of all? Everything I ever gave him was real. The home, the holidays, the loyalty. But he'd traded it all for a younger woman with shiny lip gloss and a short attention span. And now he'd learn what betrayal truly looked like when it wore heels and smiled sweetly on its way out the door. It's a strange thing, returning to the life you never really left. One moment you're folding laundry in a sunlit bedroom beside a man who thinks he owns the world, and the next, you're back in a concrete building with no windows, running your fingers over a thumb drive of evidence that could take that world apart piece by piece. The morning after the call, I walked through the glass doors of a federal building in D.C., using credentials I hadn't flashed in over a decade. I passed faces I hadn't seen in years, some nodding with respect, others blinking with surprise, all of them processing the same thing. Claire Evans was dead. Alexandra Hunter was home. Agent Myers met me at the elevator with a smirk that said he wasn't surprised in the slightest. He handed me a folder thick enough to stop a bullet and said, "We pulled the hard drives from his firm." You were right. Offshore money trails, shell corporations, illicit consulting deals, he left fingerprints everywhere. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. I simply opened the file, scanned the transactions I'd already memorized by heart, and began to build the final version of the case I had been crafting in the shadows for nearly 15 years. Every line item, every payment, every conveniently timed wire transfer had been a breadcrumb. Jonathan always thought he was too clever, too untouchable, too respected in his professional circles to ever be questioned. He thought the power he wielded over employees, over interns, over me, his quiet little wife, meant no one was watching. But I was always watching. And now I was finished waiting. There's something ironic about sitting in a briefing room surrounded by men in tailored suits, all of them poring over your ex-husband's fraudulent financial statements while sipping coffee from paper cups. They spoke in acronyms and legal codes and asset recovery terms, but I didn't need the jargon. I had lived every page of this case. I had memorized it, inhaled it, studied it the way most people study maps before crossing dangerous terrain. And God, had it been dangerous. I still remember the first time I really found something. We were only 3 years into the marriage. Jonathan had left his laptop open one night, too distracted by the scotch in his glass and the celebratory news that one of his creative investments had finally paid off. I saw the email briefly before the screen dimmed. It was encrypted, but I knew the keywords. I'd been trained for exactly this kind of language. Consulting arrangement, the email said. Unregistered compensation. Foreign interest party satisfied with transfer. I went cold. I excused myself, walked upstairs, and sat in the hallway with my back against the wall while I silently entered every detail into a secure note on a burner phone hidden in a box of tampons at the back of my closet. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep many nights after that. I played the role to perfection. The loving wife. The slightly airheaded entrepreneur. The woman who needed his guidance with taxes and corporate forms because numbers were just not my thing. And the more I let him think he was smarter than me, the more careless he became. He called me boring behind my back. I knew. He texted his friends about how she's sweet but not exactly thrilling. I saved those texts too, screen captured them and filed them under psychological profile. Everything had its place. Just like I did. Meanwhile, I was documenting every lie. I tracked the payments to the Dubai firm that didn't actually exist. I recorded the hush-hush meetings in the golf club lounges. I traced the funding that ran through nonprofits he claimed to support but were nothing more than laundering pipelines in disguise. And all the while, I kissed him goodnight and let him sleep beside me, never realizing that the woman he mocked for forgetting to order his protein powder was building the case that would end his entire empire. By the time I walked away, I already had everything. Back in the present, Myers passed me another folder. "You sure you don't want someone else to handle the prosecution packet?" he asked. "You've already done the heavy lifting. We can take it from here." I shook my head once. "No. I want to see this through. Every page." At that exact moment, in some overpriced condo filled with furniture I picked out and candles I used to buy in bulk, Jonathan Evans was unraveling. I knew it without needing eyes on him. He would have spent the morning cursing into his phone, trying to withdraw funds from accounts that no longer existed in his control. His business partner would have ghosted him after receiving a polite inquiry from federal agents. The shell companies would be collapsing one by one, now that the puppet strings were exposed. And Melissa, poor girl, would be sitting cross-legged on the floor, looking up at him with wide, mascaraed eyes, slowly realizing that her sugar daddy had a bitter aftertaste. Panic would be setting in. Jonathan always folded under pressure. He was good at pretending to lead, but the moment the ground shifted beneath him, he'd start running in circles, barking orders at people who'd long since stopped listening. I could almost hear his voice, angry, defensive, repeating the same useless line. Claire wouldn't do this. Claire was just my wife. She didn't know anything. And that's the part that would haunt him most. The realization that Claire wasn't just Claire. She was Alexandra Hunter. There's a kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from pulling the final thread and watching an empire unravel at your fingertips. It's not dramatic, not theatrical the way people assume. It's meticulous, controlled, choreographed down to the second. And for someone like me, someone who spent 15 years pretending to be someone else, it's also deeply personal. By the time Jonathan's assets were officially frozen, I had already submitted 3 comprehensive dossiers to the Justice Department. Each document was layered with time-stamped evidence, digital records, forensic audits, and recorded conversations he never knew I captured. I made sure every breadcrumb he left behind was neatly followed and preserved, each one leading directly to him. The sting operation began not in a high-speed chase or a late-night raid, but in a boardroom calm and fluorescent lit, where a team of financial crimes experts, cybersecurity analysts, and fraud investigators gathered around a projection of Jonathan's empire. We had diagrams, graphs, photographs, and flagged bank accounts arranged like a masterpiece of corporate deception. Phase 1, I said, clicking the remote, begins Monday at 9 a.m. All partner accounts will receive subpoenas. His legal team will be caught off guard. He's been using the same 2 lawyers for years, and both are compromised. Agent Myers raised an eyebrow. "What about the shell nonprofits?" "Already exposed," I replied. "The moment we pull the tax documents, the press will start circling." He's been using donations to funnel money to offshore assets disguised as humanitarian efforts. No one in the room spoke for a moment. I could feel their eyes flickering with a mix of admiration and discomfort. Most agents don't embed for 15 years. Most don't marry their target. Most don't hold hands with the man they're planning to destroy. But I had. And now I was ready to end it. By the time the subpoenas hit inboxes across 4 states and 3 countries, Jonathan's phones were ringing nonstop. His CFO resigned that afternoon. His head of operations deleted her LinkedIn profile and booked a one-way flight to Switzerland. Even Melissa, sweet little Melissa, left the condo in tears, dragging 2 suitcases behind her and screaming something about being tricked into living with a criminal. Jonathan tried to call me. Of course he did. He used every number he had, every contact in his phone, every social media account he once said he didn't bother with. I watched the missed calls pile up on a burner phone I kept in a drawer, each one more frantic than the last. I never answered. I wanted the silence to echo. Then came the press leak. Anonymous sources, me, naturally, shared key details of the investigation with a trusted journalist at the Washington Ledger. Within hours, headlines erupted across every platform, corporate kingpin tied to massive fraud ring. Whistleblower exposes decade of financial deception. Wife or spy? The double life of Claire Evans. I watched the footage from my apartment, sipping coffee while news anchors dissected my marriage like it was an episode of a high-stakes drama. The press loved it, of course. A perfect cocktail of betrayal, power, and poetic justice. A man who thought he had everything now had nothing but a stack of federal charges and a crumbling reputation. 3 days later, the arrest came. He was in his office, of course he was, surrounded by leather chairs and empty bravado when the agents entered. He stood up, all puffed chest and barked orders, thinking he could bluff his way through the confrontation. But when they placed the cuffs on his wrists and read the charges, fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, obstruction of justice, his face finally cracked. They say the eyes don't lie, and I saw the moment his broke. He was still wearing the watch I gave him for our 10th anniversary. I remember picking it out with care, knowing I'd use it as a timestamp in my surveillance photos. Every gift I ever gave him had dual purpose, love wrapped around strategy. At the detention center, I requested a private meeting. Not because I needed closure, but because I wanted to watch him try to look me in the eye now that the masks were off. When I entered the room, he was already seated, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The bravado was gone, the arrogance melted into confusion and fear. "Claire," he said quickly, his voice cracking on my name like it was too fragile to hold. "No. Wait, you're not Claire. I don't even know who you are." I sat across from him, folding my hands slowly on the table. "That's the first true thing you've said in years," I replied calmly. "You never knew me." He leaned forward, desperate now. "Why would you do this? We were married. We had a life together. You can't tell me none of it was real." I tilted my head slightly, studying him like I once studied criminal profiles. "You thought I was weak. You thought you could cheat and lie and steal without consequence because you assumed I was simple." He opened his mouth, but I cut him off. "You underestimated me," I said, letting each syllable land like a blow. "Now, Jonathan, you're going to understand what it means to lose everything." His eyes flickered. Shame. Anger. A hint of something else. Regret, maybe. But it didn't matter anymore. I stood slowly, not needing to say anything else. The case was airtight. The press would devour his legacy. The partners who once toasted to his success were now testifying against him. There was no parade. No dramatic, final confrontation. No confetti falling from the sky when the judge sentenced Jonathan Evans to 12 years in federal prison without the possibility of early release. Justice doesn't always come with spectacle. Sometimes, it arrives in a courtroom that smells faintly of stale coffee and printer toner, spoken in the steady monotone of a federal judge who's seen one too many men like Jonathan in the defendant's seat, self-important, entitled, and wholly unprepared for accountability. I watched the sentencing from the back row, dressed in civilian clothes, my badge tucked away in the inner pocket of a blazer he'd once said made me look too severe. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The evidence had spoken for me long before any of us stepped into that courtroom. The paper trail was ironclad, the witnesses prepared, and the trail of broken laws too vast for even the most expensive lawyer to untangle. When the judge asked if the defendant had anything to say, Jonathan stood slowly, visibly thinner, shoulders hunched in a way I'd never seen before. Gone was the polished arrogance, the smooth charm, the slick tie and cufflinks he used to wield like armor. He mumbled something about mistakes, about betrayal, about not knowing what was real. And in that moment I realized I felt Nothing. Not triumph. Not rage. Not even vindication. Just the quiet, subtle click of a door closing behind me. Later that day, I walked along the Potomac, the air crisp with the kind of early spring chill that carried promise rather than punishment. DC always had a way of reminding you where you were, its history embedded in every brick, every street lamp, every monument built to honor the ideals we tried so hard to live up to. I stood there a while, watching the water ripple under a pale sky, letting the silence settle into my bones. The last 5 years of the operation had been the hardest, not because the work was demanding, it always was, but because somewhere along the way, the lines between my role and my reality had begun to blur. I had spent so long pretending to be someone else that when it was finally time to reclaim my name, I had to ask myself what that even meant anymore. Alexandra Hunter. Special agent. Daughter. Operative. Survivor. But who was I beyond the title? Beyond the mission? That was the question I had been afraid to ask. Because revenge, as intoxicating as it can be in the planning, leaves behind a silence once it's done. And in that silence, you're forced to confront the cost. Yes, Jonathan was behind bars. Yes, his empire had crumbled. Yes, the media had dissected his downfall with the same fervor they once used to celebrate his success. But no news article could restore the years I lost pretending to be someone I wasn't. No courtroom sentence could rewrite the nights I stayed awake wondering if the woman he thought I was, the one he mocked, dismissed, and underestimated, had been too deeply stitched into my skin. Closure is never as clean as people think it is. It doesn't come with a final, satisfying exhale. It comes in pieces, quietly, slowly, like sunlight slipping through a half-open curtain after years in the dark. I moved into a small row house in Georgetown, nothing extravagant, but entirely mine. The walls were bare at first, no traces of the life I'd left behind, no wedding photos, no awards from the bureau, no shadows of the woman who had once answered to the name Claire Evans. I filled the rooms with things that mattered to me now, books I loved, photographs from before the assignment, art picked up on quiet walks through weekend markets. For the first time in years, my space was my own. I declined interviews, turned down the book offers, politely refused the documentary pitch. The world was fascinated with the idea of the spy wife who brought down her husband. But I didn't owe anyone that story. That story belonged to me. And I had already lived it. Once was enough. Instead, I returned to the bureau on my terms. No undercover work. No deep cover missions. I took a position training new recruits, teaching them not just how to follow the rules, but how to listen to their instincts, how to survive the long silences between actions, how to remain whole when a role threatens to swallow them entirely. Some days I missed the adrenaline. Other days I was grateful for the stillness. One afternoon, walking out of Quantico, I passed a trainee in the courtyard. She was sitting alone on a bench, flipping through a field manual with a crease in her brow that reminded me of myself, back when I believed every question had a right answer. I stopped, nodded, and said something that surprised me as much as it surprised her. "You don't have to sacrifice yourself to be good at this." She blinked at me, nodded slowly, and I kept walking. That evening, I sat on my porch as the sun dipped low over the rooftops. I sipped tea, not coffee, not whiskey, just tea, and watched the light change, casting everything in shades of gold. I thought about the girl I had once been, the woman I became, and the person I was now. I thought about the years spent collecting evidence, pretending, hiding, enduring. I thought about Jonathan, sitting in a prison cell, replaying every moment and realizing too late that I had never once been what he imagined. And then, finally, I smiled. Not because I had won. Not because I had broken him. But because I had walked through fire and still recognized myself on the other side. The future was unwritten. And for the first time in a long time, it belonged only to me. I wasn't Claire anymore. I wasn't just Agent Hunter either. I was a woman who had reclaimed her life, and that, in the end, was the greatest redemption of all.